So our speaker, our first speaker, Ojinga, has a fantastic background, and we're excited to have Ojinga and his wife speaking with us. And there's a nice bio about that. I'm not going to read all that, but just to tell you a little bit about Ojinga. He's the clinical director at the Carter Clinic and CEO. He got his MD from the University of Tennessee, and he did his residency in psychiatry and internal medicine at Duke. He also trained with Harold Conant, and you guys know that. Harold's a strong friend of the ministry, and he has expertise in psychiatric services, not only for a whole multitude of things, but particularly for psychotic and mood and cognitive anxiety disorders. So, really expert in what we wanted to address. He's done lots of teaching in Bible and mental health. Strong believer, and we're really glad to have him. He did actually, what's interesting, he also did research with Harold for 2 years at what's now the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative. And if you have any trainings, it's good to encourage them. Mark Perlman helps oversee that. Warren Kinghorn also does that. It's a great one-year thing for potential trainees to do. Ojinga has a great vision to want to expand access to comprehensive mental health. We're excited to have him, but before he comes to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Good.
Well, thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you all for having us. It's such a treat to present the TCMDA. I think it's a tremendous honor to speak to such an esteemed group who love the Lord and who love their field of helping discipline. It's a blessing for me to be here with my wife, and it was a whole family affair. My slides were the best I could do, but my daughter, my wife, I think, insisted my daughters help me out. So a couple of my daughters are helping put the slides together. So it's I look a lot more professional and polished than the reality it is. Today we get to talk a little bit about addiction in America, and we're also going to talk about the COVID-19 experience that we all are so familiar with. I am been with the Carter Clinic for 15 years. We're the owner and CEO of the Carter Clinic, where I work with my wife. And we have offices in North Carolina, and 10 offices throughout the southeastern North Carolina. And we've been very blessed to be able to ride the waves of mental health change that's been going on so many years. It's a very interesting time in medicine. Medicine has changed, as you all know. It's really push toward integrated care. Hopefully will allow better services for our clients, but also my hope is also that the doctors and other helping professionals will have an opportunity to show forth their talents and engage their clients in a much better and more consistent way than we have heretofore. Okay, substances and substance abuse. I'm going to go a little fast. In preparation, I realized that I thought it was the only presenter today, and my wife was helping me to realize there are other presenters, so we're going to have so much more to say than we'll probably have time. The ancient Chinese, Egyptians, and Greeks, Indians, Romans, and Arabs all either cultivated or consumed opium more than 1,000 years ago, as well as other drugs. We're going to focus a little bit on opium today, opiates, speaking and moving through history, getting to the point where we're talking about the current opiate epidemic that we find ourselves in. There have been drug use for thousands of years, recreational use for a similar amount of time. The earliest were the Sumerians who cultivated poppy and isolated opium for their seeds in 3000 BC. They called opium gil or joy, and the plant they called whole gil. So we also probably appreciate that there have been ancient uses for opium in the way of medicine. And one of the earliest examples of that was the Eber Papyrus in 1500 BC, one of mankind's oldest medical documents. It describes a remedy to prevent excessive crying in children using grains of poppy plants strained through pulp, passing through the sleeve. So using opium, which I don't think any one of us would be acceptable today, but of course back then they did it, and you'll see that again, that this was not an uncommon or isolated instance. So using these substances is not the problem, right? Because they are effective in the short term, and maybe sometimes even in the long term, but the problem is the addiction that accompanies them over time. As many as 1 in 4 people who use opiates, long-term therapy will become addicted. All right, how many people here think the Bible is a fascinating book, is a unique book among books? I want to take a little bit of a detour. So the DSM-5 is the criteria for substance use disorder. All right? This is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for those who are not aware. This is the Bible for mental health. We have about 11 criteria here that help us to define whether or not someone has a substance use disorder. So the first one is use in larger amounts for longer periods of time, longer periods of time than intended. Successful efforts to cut down or quit. Unsuccessful efforts to cut down or quit. Excessive time spending using the drug, intensive desire to urge to use, also called cravings, failure to fulfill major obligations, continued use despite social or interpersonal problems, hobbies or activities are reduced, recurrent use in physically hazardous situations, recurrent use despite physical or psychological problems caused by worsening use, intolerance and withdrawal. All right, so these are 11 criteria for helping us to diagnose substance use disorders. Having a biblical description of substance use disorders, where can we find that? Well, we actually find that in the Psalms. Psalms 23, 29 to 35. Who has woe, who has sorrow, who has strife, who has complaints, who has needless bruises, who has bloodshot eyes, those who linger over wine, those who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. Do not gaze at the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake, and poisons like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, your mind will imagine confusing things. You will be like one sleeping on the high seas on top of the rigging. The rigging is the little thing on top of the mast that sits high. They hit me, you will say, but I'm not hurt. They beat me, but I do not feel it. All right, so it's an amazing correlation you can see with the description of the DSM-5 and the description of substance abuse in the Bible. All right, failure to meet major obligations. All right, so the way to see this is, if you ask the question, who has woe, who has sorrow? Those who failure to meet major obligations. All right. Who has strife, who has complaints, which suggests social or interpersonal problems. Those continue to use despite social or interpersonal problems. Excessive time spent using, those who linger long over wine. Use in larger amounts, which suggests increased potency for longer periods of time. Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. So it goes from wine, it connects that with a more intense experience of wine, mixed wine. Cravings, intense use. So if anyone's keeping score, I think we're about six now. Cravings or intense use, do not gaze at the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup. So that's what we said already. However, I think it speaks of the potential for craving, right? So if cravings are oftentimes brought on by triggers. And so it's suggesting don't be triggered. Don't go in a place or a situation that will trigger you to desire to use. Okay? Hobbies and activities reduced. So again, we're going here. You may not go with me on this one, but still we're stretching this one verse a little bit. But it says, go to sample bowls of mixed wine. So you're spending your time going to do things other than possibly your hobbies or activities. All right, you may or may not give me that one. Recurrent use despite physical hazardous situations. All right, you will be like one sleeping on a high seas, lying on top of the rigging. So the rigging, again, is on top of the mast, it's very high in the sky on a ship. That is the definition of physically hazardous, right? You're sleeping in that place, right? So, physically hazardous situations. Recurrent use despite physical and psychological problems, cause are made worse by use. So who has needless bruises? That is, or who has bloodshot eyes? So needless bruises are things that you do to yourself, right? That harm yourself. Certainly we know people who have substance abuse problems do things that harm themselves. Who has bloodshot eyes? That suggests that the substance is doing something to you. You're a physical person. You're, causing bloodshot eyes, right? So that's a physical consequence of using. And we know substances will cause physical damage to the person who's using them, to the physical body. All right, tolerance. Who goes to sample mixed bowls of wine? I'm stretching that one a little bit, but still, it talks about wine and needing something more than what you usually use, needing something more potent, more intensive. That is tolerance. Okay, and then withdrawals. Now this one is a little fascinating. When will I wake up so that I can find another drink? When will I wake up suggests, hold on, someone is sleeping, but they're asking when they're waking up. So it's almost like there's a process going on within the person that they're not completely conscious of, right? And that's certainly true in substance abuse. They're not completely in control of what's going on. But even if you didn't want to go there, if you didn't like that psychological analysis, when I wake up, so I can find another drink. That is one of the cage questions almost verbatim. One of the cage questions. The cage questions were one of the four questions that you ask to see whether or not somebody has a particular alcohol use disorder. So this is like right out of the cage questions, which talks about physical withdrawal. So you have to, it's a wake me up. It's a question, do you need an eye opener when you get up in the morning to address your tremors, which is physical withdrawal. All right, what do y'all think about that? Fascinating, huh? The Bible is more current than tomorrow's newspaper. All right, early management of addictive substances. So when we see ancient societies grappling with this dilemma and coming up with some of the same solutions seen in modern societies. So first you will have a naive acceptance of the drug. And then, I forgot to hand out, I forgot to hand out get the handouts. All right. So, first you have naive acceptance of the drug. All right. So, the drug is occurring in the community, no one really appreciates what's going on. And then you have prohibition of penalties associated with it. People begin to see the negative consequences. And then oftentimes in society you will see taxation or other types of regulations for the drug. Substance use and epidemics. Early efforts at substance use control were sometimes brutal. In 1379, the Ottoman Emir in Egypt, the Sultan Sukari, was determined to stamp out hashish use, which is a form of THC. Farmers grew hashish, who grew hashish were imprisoned or even executed, and those found guilty of consuming it were said to have had their teeth pulled out. Another Ottoman Sultan, Murad IV, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, had smokers ran the risk of being beheaded, and then the first Tsar of Russia, smokers ran the risk of having their lips cut off. Well, these were a little brutal, but the attempts at trying to control this out of control behavior. The Chinese opium epidemic. So this sprang from an innovation, and innovation is something we will see currently in our talk today. This sprang from an innovation in ingesting opium. Historically, people would chew it. And that's how they would get the effects of the drug. But then smoking became popular, and once that happened, it was delivering a higher quantity of the drug to the individual, and so it was therefore much more potent. People have theorized why the Chinese were much more susceptible to this than, for example, in India, because the Indian culture had also been users of opium, chewing, and it may have had to do with the fact that smoking had already been accepted in China. and so smoking this drug was a little bit more consistent with their previous traditions. But by the end of the 17th century, this impact on the opium trade had dramatically changed. This one innovation had dramatically changed the opium trade. Smoking presented greater addiction potential than when the opium was eaten, and greatly increased the demand. And so there was a long history, as you can see, from 1883 all the way to 1906. So a long history, a lot of give and taking back and forth. The Chinese government, seeing the addiction, resisted it. The British, not appreciating all the negative effects, fought the British East India Company fought to continue to have the trade happen. The British Navy got involved, and there was a war called the Opium Wars. At the end of the war, there was a Treaty of Nangang in 1842 ceding Hong Kong to the British. So that's a piece of history. Okay, so we're missing an important slide, and I'll just tell it to you. So what happened as a result, you had significant substance use and addiction in the Chinese population. So never before had there been such an epidemic of opium use, and never on the scale that existed at that time. According to official Chinese figures, in 1907, opium consumption affected 23% of the male population and 3.2% of the female population. So 23% of the population was addicted. The Chinese was consuming 85 to 95% of the global opium supply at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century. Outrage came from the faith communities about the effects of opium trade on communities all over the world. And in 1874, a group of Quaker reformers in London formed the Society for the Suppression of Opium Trade, which emerged as an effective group in the United Kingdom and influenced the opium trade. This involved many denominations, and it mentions Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterians, and others adopted this cause and changed the trajectory of the opium trade. All right. America's first opiate epidemic. So this is really meanwhile in America. So because the same problem was occurring in America with the opium trade. Now opium epidemic in America followed that same pattern. And that is, at first it was generally accepted. Before the Civil War, opium was commonly used to treat a variety of ailments in Europe. Edgar Allan Poe was famously addicted to chewing opium. Landrium, an opium and alcohol combination, was popular as a sleeping aid and a painkiller in Europe and in America. Pregoric, opium mixed with camphor, was often given to fretful babies. It was also popular as sleeping aid and painkiller in the mid-1800s. But the catalyst for the real opium epidemic in America came during the Civil War. There was widespread use of opiates to ease pain with a new invention and innovation, the syringe. A hypodermic needle and syringe in 1850 resulted in many more war-wounded returning home addicted. By the end of the conflict, the term soldier's disease came into existence to describe post-war addicts. And this is an example of the hypodermic syringe that was innovated. Another cause of the first opium epidemic in America was fraudulent marketing by pharmaceutical entrepreneurs. The case in point was Bayer. In the late 1800s, so-called patent medicines. And patent medicines, this is before the FDA and all. Patent medicines were medicines that, if you wanted to be a pharmaceutical entrepreneur, you could find some products and you put it together and get a cool label and put your name on it and a fancy title, and you had a medicine. It was your patent. You were patented with the medicine, and no one else could use your name or your label, but that's pretty much what it was. And so this is an example you see of a patent label that was used to treat the cough. Cough, problem solved. The problem has been solved. by glycoheroin. You all see that, glycoheroin? So this is one recent example of pharmaceutical companies, in particular Bayer, sold cough syrup containing heroin. All right. So the problems were ongoing, and the general public was becoming much more aware of there being a problem. And in addition to the general public, physicians were becoming more aware of this being a problem. And so I found in my study and my research this cool article from you all probably can't really see that, but it's from 1890 on the evils of eating opium. A fascinating article by Dr. Watson in JAMA in 1889. The practice of eating opium in some of its forms is pervading this country to an alarming extent. The preponderance of evidence is positive that the evil is rapidly on the rise. We gather from the Bureau of Statistics that we report, and it goes on to talk about what they reported in 1867, and in 1880 it was more than 3 times as much, or nearly 3 times as much as he had reported at that time. So this steady increase should be added to the country, in the country, the southern states were already growing opium at the time. And he goes on in the article, interesting article, to talk about the dangers of heroin use, the addiction, how difficult it is to come off of heroin. Also, he talks about in the article, he uses the term evil, which is something you may not see in the JAMA today. He uses, he asked preachers directly. He said that preachers should be much more involved in talking to their congregants about the dangers of heroin use and how difficult it is to get off of it. But this, along with other forces, caused new legislation to finally contain new legislation from the states and from federal legislation that urged on by doctors and other organizations such as the temperance movement to have legislation passed. The first one was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated food and drugs in interstate commerce and laid the foundation for the nation's first consumer protection agency, the FDA. And then the Harrison Act of 1914 required narcotics be manufactured, sold, and distributed. Manufacturers who manufactured or sold or distributed products be registered with the IRS. And then the Heroin Act of 1924 prohibited the production, use, or possession of heroin, even for medicinal use. So these acts went a long way in stemming the tide of heroin addiction in America, and it begins to wane and fall to the background. But also, meanwhile, at the same time, you find America had an alcoholism problem. So American alcoholism had its roots starting back in 1830s. So this is a picture of an out-of-control father in the home and presumably drunk with alcohol. By 1830, the average American used, By 1830, the average American over the age of 15 consumed nearly 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year, which is about 3 times as much as we drink today. Alcohol abuse, primarily by men, was wreaking havoc on many lives. Women and children were particularly vulnerable. Women had few legal rights at that time and were utterly dependent on their husbands for sustenance and support. The temperance movement was one of the country's first serious anti-alcoholic movements, and it grew out of a religious fervor from the Second Great Religious Awakening. This religious movement swept the nation in the early 1800s and the 1830s. And the Second Great Awakening, you all are probably aware, was established by charismatic preachers in intense meetings that encouraged their congregants to receive Christ for salvation and to live out their convictions with moral behavior. And evangelicalism was an important aspect of this movement. During this time, a very important time in American history, many churches experienced great increase in membership, particularly amongst Methodists and Baptists. It spurred many religious movements, including the temperance movement, which we're talking about today, the abolitionist movement, missionary societies and the founding of several colleges and seminaries. The temperance movement, again, was primarily made up of women, although of course there were men involved, who were struggling with what they saw was wrecking their families. So many members were women tired of dealing with the drunken family members. They sometimes went into saloons and confronted the saloon owners and the customers in the saloon. So they had some direct confrontation. But primarily they brought awareness to the problem of alcoholism in America. And the movement was a powerful, powerfully effective movement that carried significant favor with public officials. And so as a result of this, we get Prohibition, the war on alcohol. So Prohibition, as you probably know, started in 1920. But it really resulted in a culmination of years and years of activism and education, and to address the ills of alcoholism in America. While the prohibition of alcohol was undertaken by Christian organizations, it was supported by politicians, economists, and social scientists, and other academics believing that it would reduce crime and corruption, solve social problems such as domestic violence, child welfare concerns, reduce the tax burden created by prisons and poorhouses, and would improve the health and hygiene of America. In the 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was signed, making alcohol, manufacture, sale, or transportation illegal. So, Prohibition is also called the noble experiment. And I think we all agree that it was certainly a noble motive involved in the 18th Amendment, but it had some unintended consequences. So, after the implementation of Prohibition in America, the resources devoted to enforcement of Prohibition actually ended up costing more for the American budget. The annual budget for the Bureau of Prohibition went from $4.4 million to $13.4 million in the 1920s. Also, it made drinking more dangerous. The County law, iron law prohibition, basically the idea that the more intensely you enforce something, the more potent the substance that you're trying to enforce will become. And certainly is what happened with alcohol. It resulted in greater consumption of hard liquor because one could smuggle more alcohol content in smaller quantities and also at a lesser cost, right? So imagine someone, instead of sitting down and drinking beer openly in a restaurant, you would have to you would just add a little alcohol to your coffee or something like that in a way that you would not notice that the person was drinking alcohol.
Whiskey Rebellion was the first put down by George Washington, Pennsylvania. They found that selling whiskey was a lot more profitable than selling corn, but there was no tax on it. So he had to put down the farmers who were rebelling against the taxation of whiskey. It was Washington's first civil disorder.
Yeah. Thank you for that piece of history. So this challenge of alcohol in America has been in most societies, as you know, it goes back to Noah and the wine vineyard, has been a challenge for us for a long time. And there are substances that we like, and we humans will continue to try to take, and there was always give and take between government and what's good for people. All right. So crime increased. According to a study of 30 major U.S. cities, the number of crimes increased in 1924. The number of crimes increased 24% between 1920 and 1921. So in 1 year, this is what's been reported. Arrests for drunkenness and disorderly conduct increased 41%, and arrests of drunken drivers increased 81%. And there was a general increase in crimes with victims. Thefts, burglaries increased 9%, while homicides and incidents of assault and battery increased 13%. Corruption increased amongst law enforcement, as many were complicit. Crime became organized. Prohibition gave rise to American Mafia and the violence that resulted from territorial control. So this is debated a little bit, but it is, once you made alcohol manufacturing and production crime, those who did it in an organized way were obviously organized criminals. And those were individuals who became much more proficient in it. And we do see the rise of the mafia during this time. All right. Not only did the number of serious crimes increase, but murder increased as well. So remember these things. These are things we will see again. Not only did the number of serious crimes increase, but murder increased as well. The homicide rate increased to 10% per 100,000 in the population during the 1920s, and 78% overall in the over the pre-prohibition period. So here's a graph just illustrating this. It comes from this U.S. Bureau of the Census and Historical Statistics in the United States. All right. So per 100,000 population, you can see 1910, the graph starts, I don't know how well, but yeah, you can see that pretty well probably. And then it goes up and you see a marked increase after 1920. Well, actually what you actually see is a gradual rise, don't you? You really just see a gradual rise over time, sort of culminating in 1931, 32. And then you also do see a precipitous fall after 1933. All right, and that was in murders. President Herbert Hoover, who once called prohibition the great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in its purpose, he was subsequently defeated by someone, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who actually was campaigning on the repeal of prohibition. So in 1933, FDR signed the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, repealing the 18th Amendment and ending the war against alcohol or prohibition. And one of the most telling signs of the relationship between serious crime and prohibition was the dramatic reversal in the rates of robbery, burglary, murder, and assault when prohibition was repealed in 1933. And so you can see this precipitous fall in the murder rate. Okay. And at the end of this, I'm not going to be advocating for all legalizing of all drugs. Just to be clear about that. That's not where we're going with this. All right. All right. The success of the temperance movement. So in some articles, it would suggest that the temperance movement is not as successful, but the reality is that, as you can see in this graph, the nearly 100-year-old movement had actually been changing alcohol consumption prior to the 18th Amendment. And it did that through awareness of the ills of alcoholism and advocacy about it, and those changed the behaviors of Americans. So you can see here, before 1920, you can see that the use of alcohol had been going down. And it actually has stayed, if you look over time, it actually stays down and decreases. All right. This slide is a little out of order. The cocaine epidemic in American cities. So, going back here. So in about 1977 and 1978, an innovation in cocaine occurred called freebasing. Freebasing is the process of freeing the cocaine from the base of the salt for which cocaine is naturally found. The result is a more pure, more potent form of cocaine called crack cocaine. And from 1930 to 1970 that I'm talking about now, we know that there was obviously drug and alcohol use, and of course famously in the 70s, or late 60s, early 70s, was a tumultuous time in American history, and there's a lot more marijuana in particular use, hard drugs such as cocaine, really didn't come to the fore again, to the front again until now, where you had widespread use. And I will not what my wife's topic is. I'm going to let her have her talk more about marijuana use. How much time I have? Okay. So this new innovation resulted in a more potent form of cocaine. Another curious thing happened. The amount of cocaine produced in the mid to late 1970s grew tremendously. And because there was not sufficient demand, the price dropped precipitously. The cost of cocaine was as little as $3 to $5 for one hit or one cocaine experience. This level of access to cocaine for a poor population had really never occurred before. Heretofore, cocaine had been around, but it really only was available for those who had means, who had wealth, to be able to afford to purchase it on an ongoing basis. So, because of this, there have been a lot of there was a conspiracy theory surrounding what happened, why did cocaine become so prevalent, and certainly in certain circles. There's a conspiracy about how it affected the African American community. Okay, so this new drug finds fertile ground in the inner cities, where manufacturing jobs have moved away. The flight to the suburb undermined the city's tax base. There were underfunding of schools, lower literacy rates, negative policing practices, generational poverty, and a legacy of racial discrimination have left these cities, inner cities, in despair. So the cocaine epidemic of the American cities, the drugs were an option when there were few other clear options. Whether to feel better through self-medication or as a way of making money by selling drugs to take care of the family you love, cocaine presented itself, and crack cocaine in particular, as an option. The violence that occurred because of the mafia-like, the violence that occurred was mafia-like and had occurred 60 years earlier and involved the controlling of territory. If you control more territory, you had a viable business. And so you had these turf wars and drug wars and violence in the streets. And the violence brought on the war on drugs, and it was famously established in the mid to late 80s. Again, an effort, necessary, positive effort, but it had a lot of negative consequences. Some of the negative consequences were more aggressive policing, more aggressive sentencing, targeting particularly crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, and the consequences of that, stigmatizing, scapegoating users rather than seeking solutions to the economic dilemma that nurtured the problem to begin with. And what resulted was a cultural change. Ultimately, the prison population doubled because of the arrest of drug dealers and customers, and resulted in 1 in 4 African American males aged 20 to 29 was either incarcerated or on probation on parole by 1989, which is remarkable. That statistic had increased to nearly 1 in 3 by 1995. Again, this level of policing and incarceration will result in a cultural change in the community. In the United States, it had the highest incarceration rate in the world, of course, still does. It is estimated that the murder rate in young black males doubled soon after crack cocaine enters into a city, and that these rates were still around 70% higher than the pre-crack arrival rates 17 years later. So 17 years after, the murder rates are still very high. The role of increased gun possession and as a mechanism for this increased murder has been discussed, postulated in the literature. And so this cultural change, many of you may be of that same generation. I certainly am of this generation. This cultural change had as its proponents, biggest proponents, was the rap music. And so there was rap music before, but then there was this came on what we call gangster rap music. And I listened to it growing up. You may or may not know this artist who has the gun in the picture, but that's Ice Cube. He's a pretty popular movie star figure nowadays, but he was a part of a group called NWA. So the increasing influence of gangs in the community, gang control, and the distribution of a network for crack cocaine. But of course, the local gangs were not flying cocaine in from Colombia, right? So these are just the community people who there's certainly other individuals, other things at play that allow cocaine to be come into communities at that scale. During this period of time, the popularization of criminal activity in music and dress occurs. The music glorified the gangster lifestyle and really had an ongoing negative impact on the community. The guns and the violence also created a destructive feedback loop. The more violence, the more the perception in the community is that you need a gun, and so this kind of feeds on itself. The murder rate in the young black males quickly rose and peaked in the 1993 to 164 per 100,000. And we just looked at a statistic earlier on in the early 1920s where the murder rate increased to 10 in 100,000. So 164 in 100,000 is really outrageous. But this rate fell to half by 1999. And between 1999 and 2004, this rate decreased, continued to decrease. However, many years later, in 2015, the murder rate for young black males was still 23% higher than it had been in 1984, which again speaks to the cultural change that went on after the drugs were introduced into the community. Okay, America's second national opiate epidemic, and I do say national opiate epidemic because there were other descriptions of opiate epidemics in American history, in particular in the Motown era and other times, but there was not really a national opiate epidemic again until 1997, which is present. So, 100 years later, after the first opiate epidemic, tens of thousands of Americans are addicted to produce pharma OxyContin, a new innovation. The OxyContin is long-acting, it's much more potent, and people go crazy over it. Purdue Pharma is making money hand over fist, but they plead guilty to illegally marketing pills as safe and non-addictive. So how do we get here 100 years later? How do we get to the point where we are again facing an opiate epidemic in America that's about to cost us more than 1 million lives? How do we get here? And why did it happen again? Well, you had pharmaceutical entrepreneurs, again, lying about their patent medicines or their products. You have them influencing the pharmaceutical industry, influenced doctors that opiates were not a problem. Individuals experiencing significant pain, they were able to be treated and it would not have ongoing addiction. We were introduced to pain as the fifth vital sign. Anybody remember that? I remember that when I was in medical residency. Pain is the fifth vital sign. I distinctly remember one of my residents saying, "Hey, it's not a problem, man." The psychiatry, I was med-psych resident, and he was a medicine resident, and of course I had a little bit of misgivings about it. But it was certainly pushed. I mean, it really pushed. They were, if you worked in a hospital setting and you had JCO coming in looking at whether or not what were your pain scales, were you treating pain? We were really pushed to do this. So where did this come from? We were really taught to let go of our inhibitions to prescribe opiate medications. Well, where was the research? Where did this come from? Well, in a lot of research articles and journals, quoted this New England Journal of Medicine article that talked about utilizing opiates to treat pain in individuals not becoming addicted. So Porter J, and I almost don't want to say the name because they're really not the corpus. This was in 1980 when they wrote this. But it said addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. This was in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1990. Well, the problem with this was not a study. This was just a letter to the editor. So it's not peer reviewed, right? It's not going to be peer reviewed. This is just an opinion, and it's not a study. It's just a talking about a study, right? That they did. But this was the article that you saw quoted over and over again as the reason why pain should be treated more aggressively, because people who did not have a history of addiction will not get addicted. And so this is the actual article in there. You can see kind of it's just a letter to the editor, and it's kind of interesting. For the sake of time, I won't read it all. But based on this stuff and based on the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, you would have addresses, and in 1995, Dr. James Campbell addressed the American Pain Society, urging that healthcare providers treat pain as the fifth vital sign, and highlighting the essential need to improve pain care in America. And shortly thereafter, you have the Veterans Administration, again the VA, introducing a national strategy to improve pain treatment that included a mandatory screening and use of unidimensional measures and rating scales to help treat pain. All right. So it's almost like we just completely forget the knowledge and understanding that we have about addiction, and we become influenced. All right. So once that happens, the brakes are off, and it's off to the races. All right. So here we have a graph displaying the total overdose rate in America, starting in 1999. And in 2000, 2001, you begin to see an increase in overdose deaths. So this is all-cause overdose deaths. The next figure, national overdose deaths involving any opiate. So these are only opiate deaths. But you will see that opiates, you go back about 2,000, a little less than 2,000 overdose deaths are occurring, and almost all of the increase in opioid deaths are from the increase in overdose and death are due to the opiates. So there are three distinct waves that we've seen as we treat opiate addiction. The first wave was a wave of rise in prescription opiates and overdose deaths. So these were the overdoses that occurred when people were taking Oxycontin and Percocets and things that doctors prescribed. Okay, so doctors were sort of woke up to the problem, and so we began to stop prescribing as many opiates. But at that point, unfortunately, the cat is kind of out of the bag. And then you see a rise in heroin overdose and deaths starting in 2010. Because as doctors are taking people off, they still are addicted, so they go to the street and try to address their habit. So you see the deaths secondary to heroin begin to rise. And you see a plateauing of the deaths that are because of the commonly prescribed opiates that doctors prescribe. And then the third wave happens when you have an innovation, a new, more potent drug that hits the market, and that's when you see the rise of synthetic opiate overdoses on drugs such as fentanyl. And you see that rising in 2013, and it has continued to rise and to really take over overdose and deaths. So again, this sort of says the same thing, the national overdose deaths involving heroin by other opiate involvement. You see the heroin, the overdoses without heroin begin to plateau and actually decrease, because now they're using heroin because they're not using the prescribed medications. And then heroin begins to fall as people are not using heroin anymore as much, but they're using fentanyl and overdosing and dying. Okay, The national overdose deaths involving stimulants is the what's next. All right. So as we are aggressively trying to address the opiate epidemic and fentanyl, the problem of fentanyl, there is something else that's coming along, and these are deaths that are that do not involve opiates at all, but involve stimulants. You see that in the green line, and you see it's ticking up. Okay. Finally, we get to substance abuse and the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, I'm about to run out of time. All right, so the ongoing stress and uncertainty of COVID-19 pandemic led to an increased demand for mental health services from psychologists and other mental health professionals in the United States. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as of June 2020, 13% of Americans reported starting or increasing substance use as a way of coping with the stress or emotions related to COVID-19. In particular, overdoses spiked since the pandemic, and the OD MAP reporting system showed that in the early months of the pandemic, nearly 18% rise in overdoses compared with the same time in 2019. The trend continued to 2020, and according to the American Medical Association, which reported in December 2020, that more than 40 U.S. states have seen this increase in opiate-related mortality. Alcohol consumption during the pandemic. This was really fascinating. 1 year increase in alcohol consumption in the U.S. during the COVID-19 pandemic is estimated will cause 8,000 additional deaths from alcoholism-related diseases. In addition to that, 18,000 cases of liver failure, 18,000 additional cases of liver failure, and 1,000 additional cases of liver cancer by 2040. Furthermore, a sustained increase in alcohol consumption for more than 1 year, so if this continues, there will be a 19 to 35% increase in additional mortality from alcohol consumption as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Reasons for the uptick in use: resilience promoting activities like attending church, physical activity, social interactions were discouraged as unsafe and became more difficult during the pandemic. Stress from loss of work, stress from loss of loved ones, with all the deaths. Many relationship stressors that occurred during the pandemic. There was an uptick in divorce during the pandemic. People began using drugs, starting using drugs, and using drugs more often and in greater quantities. Also happened as a coping mechanism during the pandemic. Some people who use substances may have started new drugs if their usual substances became more difficult to access. So that also puts you at a higher risk of overdosing death if you're using something you hadn't used before.
Has there been an increase in suicide, dramatic increase too?
Oh yeah. Just been a dramatic increase in suicide. That was what I was trying to. So overdose and death, and that includes deaths and suicide. But you're right, suicide in particular has increased. All right. So substance abuse. I'm sure I didn't skip one. Okay. Substance abuse in America, the demand problem. All right. So we've extracted hundreds of billions of dollars from the drug companies to help fund treatment. We've re-educated and sanctioned doctors to change prescribing habits. And we will continue the war on illegal drugs. But we have not dealt with the demand problem. If we look at this, and it's a supply and demand. We've addressed the supply, but we have to address the demand. Since 1970, the decline in manufacturing has hit particular regions of the community much more severely than others. The mortality crisis hit places that include suicides and overdose deaths, in places where industries where Chinese competition increased most intensely. More generally, it reflected an increased trend of automation replacing low-skilled jobs. These same communities that suffered this had pronounced declines in employment, also experienced decreases in marriage rates, increases in the percentage of prime males of prime working age out of the labor force, higher rates, a proportion of people who experience pain, and so therefore have higher opiate prescription rates. So these are the same communities that are having problems, the same communities that have lost jobs. So this is one of my sources here is where have all the jobs gone, and that in referenced in the back. All right. So the demand problem. So these, you all may have heard these deaths called deaths of despair, overdose deaths, and suicide are an uptick in our country. They've been termed deaths of despair. And again, Carol Graham and others have talked about this. They are most prevalent in the heartland of America, places where manufacturing and other blue-collar jobs have all but disappeared. Communities that formerly supported these industries are experiencing the high social costs as a result. It results in the loss of a purposeful employment, and more generally, she described the loss of hope, which is an important part of the explanation of the trends in both addiction and mortality. So this is similar, in this way, the opiate overdose crisis is similar to the cocaine epidemic that we saw in the cities in the 1980s. And I have to talk about buprenorphine because it really has been a powerful change agent in opiate epidemic in a way it has addressed demand problem psychologically. But this other part of the demand problem is one that has not been addressed. It's an economic and social problem. So the demand problem is, in reality, a need problem. It's a problem of a need. All right, so where there is no vision, the people will cast off restraints. And so in my treatment of opiate dependence and addiction, I've been treating addiction for years. I started when I was in medical school. I actually had a part-time job in addiction treatment. And that's certainly what I see. It's the cast off, there's a lack of hope. So successful addiction treatment, in my experience, addresses the need deficit within the individual. Psalms 68 and 6 says, God sets the lonely in families and leads the prisoners out with singing. So the idea of this communities of healing, have been some of the most successful interventions of substance abuse that I've seen. These are communities, AA, long-term rehab centers that develop a community of recovery. Celebrate Recovery is another great option of a recovery community. I would be remiss if I didn't mention recoveries that happen when patients are saved, and it's certainly something I've seen in my practice over and over again when they commit their lives to Jesus Christ. They have a renewed hope. They receive hope in the future. And quickly, Ecclesiastes talks about the importance of work. So this is just sort of a litany of things that seem to work in my practice that really help people begin to change their trajectory of life. The programs that build work, their value of work, and job training helps them to begin to see themselves in a different light and begin to see their future being different than what their past has been. All right, well, thank you so much. I knew I was running long. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast. So I really wanted you all to have the slides and the references in the back. I'd like to thank my family and my beautiful wife for helping me. Thank you, Dr. Dion. And thank you, CMDA, for having me. It's been an honor and a privilege to be able to come and talk to you a little bit about opioid dependence and substance abuse in general in America. I think we probably don't have much time for questions, but if you have any questions, I'll be around. Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. We're going to reconvene in 8 minutes. You'll hear the beep. And so go to the restrooms and get your refreshment coffee. Thank you so much, Ojinga. That was terrific. He's going to hang around right up here if you guys want to ask questions on that. And we'll